gonna get going. So I am, for those of you who just sign up online, I am Jorge Cañizares Izquierda, Director of the Institute. And today we'll have Diana Heredia, our fifth-year graduate student, Institute assistant, will introduce the panelists to the wider public, those present and those online. So, Diana.
Hi, everyone. Thank you to us joining us here in person and also to our guest speaker online and our online audience. I'll just do some brief introductions and then move on to discuss Dr. Grijalva's paper. So I'll start with his introduction. Dr. Richard Grijalva is an ACLCS Emerging Voices postdoctoral fellow with the Center for Mexican American Studies here at the University of Texas at Austin. His dissertation, Political Spirituality and the Idea of Mexico, from Bourbon Reforms in New Spain to Mexican Independence, 1740 to 1821, maps the history of Mexico as a concept and name through discourses and practices of spirituality and subject formation. While continuing on research on spirituality and Mexican independence, he's beginning a manuscript on key interventions from the Novohispanic / Mexican orator, historian, political thinker, and legislator, Fray Servando Teresa de Mier. Our respondents, one online, is Dr. Virginia Garrar. She is Professor Emerita of History and Latin American Studies at the University of Texas at Austin, and past director of the Lila Benson Latin American Studies and Collections. Among her numerous publications, both single author and co-authored, she is the author of most recently of The New Faces of God in Latin America, Emerging Forms of Vernacular Christianity, published with Oxford in 2020. And in person here with us is Dr. Madeline McMahon. She's a postdoctoral fellow from 2021 to 2024, also here in the Department of History at UT Austin. She earned her PhD at Princeton University in 2021, studying the intellectual and cultural history of early modern Europe, with special interests in the history of religion, historiography, science, broadly defined, and the history of the book. Her book in progress, The Catholic Creation of Knowledge in Early Modern Italy, Bishops, Their Households, and Diocesan Work, explores bishops and their employees' efforts to manage information about their dioceses during the Catholic Reformation. Welcome.
Well, thank you. So now we'll have essentially 10 minutes for you to lay out the argument for those of us who have not, well, for those of you who have not read the essay, and then Madeline will talk for 10 minutes, and then Jeannie for 10 minutes, and then you'll kind of have an opportunity to engage with the comments, and then we'll open up for discussion. Okay, so
great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jorge, for inviting me from our conversation last November. And also thank you to Drs. Gerard and McMahon. And also thank you to Trace for entertaining me earlier in the year to seeing this discussion begin to unfold. I do want to say that being at UT has been a really welcoming experience, especially with the history department and the Institute for Historical Studies. So just for some context around this particular piece, it came out of a dissertation chapter, which of course was on this notion of political spirituality and the idea of Mexico. And there were a couple problems that I had to sort of try and address in sort of going there. One, what is political spirituality? What do I mean when I'm talking about that? Because it isn't necessarily a concept inscribed within the vernacular of these particular figures that I'm discussing. But also, I noticed that there was a sort of set of the place and the time in which I was trying to track this movement from New Spain to Mexico. It was within this context that was identifiable as sort of this key turning point in Western culture, right? Where the secular and the sacred are kind of all very much intertwined, but are sort of also in the process of splitting. And in Mexico, it becomes a matter where much of a good deal of the early military action and political action was instigated and stimulated by, for lack of a better term, people who were very much involved with, or were in, if not involved, ensconced in religious communities, right? People like Hidalgo, who was, of course, a parish priest, same with Jose Maria Morelos, but also even some of the sort of second tier folks who were ultimately lawyers were all seminarians, were mostly seminarians. People like Ignacio Rayon, before they trained in law, they were in the seminary. And the ways in which they use symbols and even sort of the ways in which they use religious tropes as a way to mobilize their political discourse was always very pronounced. So I thought, maybe this would be a good place to think about this idea of spirituality. What is spirituality? And the way that I tried to think about it was in two ways. One, as a set of, if not exercises, activities, directing the attention, directing movement to develop a kind of ethos, right? Or in this sort of, this overall sort of formation of the self. And on the other hand, as a presupposition informed by those practices, right? That sometimes you can identify, more or less formal forms of spirituality, sort of structuring discourses and appearing in discursive artifacts. And that's sort of what I try to do in this chapter. And this chapter was the one that was the most vexing, I think, because there is just so much material, and I haven't even come close to scratching beneath the surface yet. And B, some of the nature of the sources can be a bit difficult to work with, because there's a lot of motivated speech within those documents, right? It's not just that somebody wants to work in the service of the nation, but they might be expecting some kind of reward or some kind of material benefit to accrue from it, by saying something, either saying something the right way or presenting themselves in a proper manner. So this again was my first stab at doing so, and this I hope becomes the beginnings of what will become a monograph where I can do a more detailed investigation, because I think there's a lot of detail here to develop. And I think that if spirituality is a sort of set of practices that direct attention and direct thinking, it will have an impact on the way in which in a certain amount of say critical mass, it will affect the sort of systems of thinking and the intellectual assumptions. And because of that, those intellectual assumptions will in turn affect those ideas that they advance. And that was, and I hope that the readers would see some of that unfolding as as this paper sort of moved along. And with that, I think I'm prepared to hear some comments and then open up a discussion, because I really was thinking about this just kind of as, does this, I come from this as a rhetorician and not necessarily as an historian. I work in the history of rhetorical theory, and I thought, what better place to try and find, to exercise those rhetorical muscles than in more or less ordinary speech situations like combat, where the speech can be very extreme, but at the same time illustrates the stakes. It is very aware of the stakes involved, really life or death? Why would somebody want to rebel? Why would, at what point do things become so intolerable that one's willing to sort of not only change their lives, right, or to give their life, but to even change the ideas that they might have held dear, right? To use something like the Lady of Guadalupe as a tutelary figure for insurgency and not for a kind of defense of state interests, to sort of form a new state or form a new people. So yeah, I think that's kind of where it's taking off from. So with that, I'll leave it to Drs. Gerard and McMahon.
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to comment on this paper. I learned a great deal reading it. So in his essay, Richard excavates the political theology at the heart of the Mexican War of Independence, expertly reading the pamphlets, broadsides, speeches, and letters of insurgents and royalists alike to observe their ideas of faithfulness and nature at work. Richard's sources are rich and fascinating, illuminating a war of words within the conflict. One disgruntled author of an 1813 tract, Luis Quijano, wrote of the world turned upside down. Rebellion is called fidelity, and tyranny is called liberty. It is not possible to move the true nature of things. As Richard shows, Quijano and others were fighting to define true fidelity and to rally nature on their side. Richard's analysis of these complex sources, rhetoric, and assumptions is sophisticated, deftly bringing out the writer's tropes and the subtler meanings of their 19th century language. So thanks again for letting me read this. I'll offer 3 thoughts and/or big questions. So first, what can we know about how the words of insurgents and royalists were read and received? In your discussion of fidelity, I was struck by the different types of media at play here: printed pamphlets, broadsides, letters, and more. You note on page 12 that denunciations from the ecclesial and civil authorities began flying at Hidalgo. Absolutely. But it would be interesting to think about what form these took and how they were accessed by the broader populace. So here I just want to show one example, one of many copies held here at the Benson Latin American collection at UT of the Inquisition's denunciation of Hidalgo, in which they accuse him of apostasy from the Catholic faith and allege, interestingly, that he thinks of fornication as a necessary effect and consequence of the mechanism of nature. So plenty going on to back up your focus on these aspects. But I bring this up too because this broadside encodes information for its own dissemination. So the next slide has some passages that really caught my eye. So the inquisitors mandate in the broadside that it be placed on all the churches of our district and that nobody remove or tear it on pain of excommunication, a fact repeated again at the bottom of the broadside. They also promise punishment to all persons without exception who approve your sedition, receive your proclamations, maintain your trato, and epistolary correspondence, reinforcing contemporaries' perceived importance of the text that you analyze for spreading revolutionary ideas at the time. Information about how these ideas spread, or at least how they ought to spread, are latent in the sources that you quote as well. So in the fragment of a letter by an insurgent from 1811 on page 22, one anonymous writer says, and I'm just sort of cherry picking here from one of those amazing paragraphs, the proclamations and edicts that I brought from your excellency's hand were shared at their destinations as you ordered, the first to each chief, captains, as well as governors and mayors of the towns indigenous. I went along sharing to wherever the recognition of America reached, and exhorting to the compatriots that they pass along word to the rest of the nearby neighbors, and the bandos were published in each reconquered town, as shown by the certifications that I requested that the parish priest distribute. So much is going on here. It almost seems that America is defined by the spread of insurgent texts, and the writer imagines both printed and oral dissemination of these words. I think bringing out the expectations of how these texts would spread and be read or heard would strengthen this essay because it would allow you to think a bit more concretely about your speakers or writers' intended audience. And that's my second big question. Who constitutes the intended audience? Where are they? And how are they getting their information about the political theology of the different parties? You sometimes refer to a contemporary Mexican reader as she, which I appreciate, but I also wonder how Hidalgo's and Quijano's imagined audience was gendered.
Mhm.
And thirdly, in your multifaceted analysis of naturaleza, I was struck by Hidalgo's own understanding of the blessed soil of Mexico on page 29. So while we rightly think of Spanish imperial attitudes towards the nature of the New World as extractive and acquisitive, to what degree was Hidalgo's view of nature different from that? That the right to use, maybe even use up natural resources belongs to Americanos and not Europeans. Hidalgo's vision that Mexico's inhabitants would enjoy all the delights that the sovereign author of nature has shed over this vast continent, revels in the imagined God-given abundance of this vast continent. And it strikes me as not so very different from instrumentalist views of nature that we see in early modern Europe. Is that right? Is this another shared rhetorical assumption between the insurgents and the royalists, or is there something else going on? Thank you again for this fascinating paper.
Thank you, that's wonderful.
Thank you. Any?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I wanted to thank Jorge for inviting me to take part in this, and I want to thank Richard for allowing me to read and comment on this excellent chapter, which I enjoyed very much. I realize it's only one chapter of a longer project, so it's quite possible that some of my comments or suggestions are addressed elsewhere in the work that you do. And now that I realize that you're a rhetorician as opposed to a historian, that explains something to me. So you promise in your title to disturb political theology and the transformation of New Spain to Mexico, and you do exactly that. The underlying parameter of this paper is the intellectual conflict unfolding between post-Tridentine Catholicism and ascendant Republican and liberal tendencies of political thought. You argue that spirituality figured into the political conflict between insurgents and royalists in New Spain in ways that were not merely ideological veils for concealing material interests or exerting control over populations' loyalties. You convincingly suggest that the Novohispanos devised novel formulations and uses for spirituality to drive the movement for independence in the early 1800s. Central to your argument is Foucault's notion of political spirituality, which is, in this context, you describe as drawing from Aquinas's notion of governance, in which we find an idea of kingly rulership based on the model of a pastorate, a model in which the sovereign governs according to the analogies designed to reproduce God's governance, God's kingdom on earth. As this model becomes contested over time by forms of escape and resistance that you describe, including the Protestant movement within the Catholic Church, and including mysticism in the early modern period, the church found ways to appropriate some of these manifestations. What you try to do here is to identify what spirituality looked like in the specific context of New Spain in the early 19th century. You ask, and I quote, to what degree did pronouncements and speech acts move beyond hortatory and into the realm of affecting the kind of behavior where an individual would be willing to put his or her life at stake to alter intolerable circumstances? And I have to say, in the book I'm currently working on, which is about revolutionary foreign priests in Central America in the 1970s, I'm asking very similar questions. So I really appreciated that. In response to this question, your work describes how sectors of the Novohispanic Church and other forms of political popular spirituality develop pieties that connect truth to patriotism, reason, judgment, and even naturaleza. You see this re-signifying going on in a very effective way. While I am solidly convinced by your argument and agree in general with you and other historians who believe that the role of spirituality and strong religious, specifically Catholic convictions, were far more than a beard for secular political ideologies in the independence period, I would love to see more about how you precisely define political spirituality. So I went back and read, I won't say reread, because in 1978, I wasn't reading Foucault, I'll admit. But when I read his What Are Iranians Dreaming About? And he actually gets quite a lot wrong in that article. It's interesting to read it with the benefit of hindsight, as we historians tend to do. He does, and he uses the term political spirituality as kind of a throwaway at the end of the article. But admittedly, he does define the phrase much more fully in his book on Iran that came later. And his apostles had defined it with even more nuance and debated about this term over the years. Without a clear definition, I think, of the way you are using it here, I think it's easy to fastly conflate that term with the kinds of religio-political movements, that are clothed kind of in the sheepskin of religious language, such as Chris Hedges describes in his book, American Fascism, when he talks about Christian nationalism and Christian restorationism and that sort of thing. And of course, there's always a danger of sort of resignifying 21st century terms for the 19th century and vice versa. And yet I think these things are so loaded and so sobresaliente at this moment in time that it's really important that you define that term as accurately as you possibly can for what you're talking about. I think it'd be really easy to misread it. Next, I want to point out that your book, and I was really kind of surprised to see it not referenced in your work, but now I think you were really working with text and not as much with historiography, and that may show up in other parts of your work. But your book is very much in conversation with Pamela Vogel's work. And I know I can see that you're familiar with her book, her first book, Alone Before God, The Religious Origins of Modernity in Mexico, which was published by Duke in 2002. And that book, I think, importantly repudiates a longstanding historiography that claimed that secularism, specifically the replacement of religious and specifically Catholic modes and influences by rationalism and individual and capitalism, are the things that paved the way for the political movements in Mexico and elsewhere that came to define Latin America's long 19th century, its political evolution in that time. Alone Before God, by contrast, argues that the Catholic Church not only engaged in the modernity that produced Mexico, but it actually actively helped to frame that. And I don't know if you've had a chance to see her new book, For God and Liberty, Catholicism and Revolution in the Atlantic World, 1790 to 1861, which Oxford just published. And I was lucky enough to get an advanced copy of, so I can speak with great authority because I don't know who else has had a chance to read it, but it's quite good. Here she builds on the idea that the age of revolution in the Spanish Atlantic was, and I quote, at its heart, a transatlantic Catholic civil war between conservative, monarchist, ultramontane, Baroque traditionalists and Reformed Catholic internationalists, she calls it, characterized by an austere Augustinian piety and enlightened intellectualism, I put in parentheses, of a sort, and an ecclesiology that favored the individual, along with an inclination toward local sovereignty that suggested proto-republican tendencies. And so because I didn't really see that in your article, but they go so nicely together, I can see your two books reviewed together, for example, in a really interesting way. I just wonder how you respond to that observation. And again, I don't say it as a criticism, but a compliment to your excellent work. And again, thank you for letting me be a part of this.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wow, I'm flattered and kind of blown away by the comments from Doctors McMahon and Gerard. So let me start with something that Dr. Gerard mentioned around sort of the defining of political spirituality, because you hit on the very thing that I'm currently wrestling with. In fact, I'm going to be working on that. I'll be presenting on that at AAR in the Foucault and the Study of Religion group in November, because it is a big methodological bugbear. And you know, within the context of a short of an article, it's really hard to lay out that theoretical framework and sort of accounting for, accounting as comprehensively as possible for how this, for the reach, for the different variables that political spirituality may touch on, and how I might be able, how I might be using this in a somewhat nominalist way, right? More as this notion of spirituality as a heuristic for at least getting a toehold to see what it is that these actors are doing through their texts, right? So I'm with you. And this is, I think, this has been sort of the very, this has been sort of the historiographical core of the inquiry, and I've always been kind of up and down about how heavy do I push on the theory and how heavy do I push on the sources, and I'm kind of wondering to what extent would a book treating this would need to do that kind of work, or devote a chapter to just doing that kind of work. I don't know if it's in an introduction or not, but this was something that I've been having to wrestle with a lot since the dissertation. So I'm glad you bring this up, because it confirms very much something that I was already, that I was already wrestling with, and I was saying, okay, good. I know there's a lot left to work on, and this is why I'm kind of bracketing this off for a second book, because it really is the more sophisticated of the two studies that I'm working on right now. And it requires, I think, a little bit more time to gestate. In terms of Pamela Vogel's discussion, which I can't wait to read her new book. I think there's also at least one other element that has to sort of get put into consideration, is the way in which, say, the Bourbon reforms wound up trying to regularize or formalize certain forms of devotional prudence and modesty, and they were, you see a lot of people sort of, or a lot of figures at that time, late 18th, early 19th century, complaining, right, about the sort of almost excessive nature of festivity and religious celebration in New Spain. And I think that might, and I think that, I don't know if that this is something that is unique to New Spain and not in other parts of the Spanish American world. I don't know, but it is really interesting that that of the different movements that develop out of the Spanish American world, the one in New Spain was much more sort of religiously based. In contrast with, say, the Bolivarian project of Gran Colombia, right? Like that was a bit more, on the continuum, sort of secular in its presentation, right? So it's interesting to see. I'd be really interested to see how Vogel sort of lays out the different battle lines in this transatlantic civil war, because and a lot of the Mexican historians of the period now sort of refer to this insurgency as kind of a civil war, as well. So I find that rather interesting. But yes, I think in terms of mobilizing political spirituality, I think the only way that I could treat it would have to be with some kind of appeal to thinking about it in a nominalist fashion, rather than a kind of say that this is a direct, that this is a direct term, when in fact it didn't exist. However, there are things in the political literature, right, that are obviously doing that. In in the early republic, you have these political catechisms, right, that would list in question and answer form, right, what is a republic, what is an independent nation, and it has the answer, and this sort of colloquy in print. One of the most famous ones, if I'm not mistaken, was by Jose Luis Mora, right, in 1831. So I think there, and this goes to sort of the question of distribution and mediatic output, right? Especially in a setting where literacy rates were rather low. Right? How did this get out to different folks, right? And the early constitutional governments, I think, were pretty, or attempts at constitutional government. When you look at, say, in Morelos and the Constitution of Apantzinga, around those projects, they also developed these calendars, these sort of revolutionary calendars with different devotional days, but also songs and popular, corridos and octavos of, around the Virgin and her revolutionary tutelage. So, and I think this is why I kind of find this chapter is kind of like just the kernel of the book that I'm gonna have to sort of, I'm gonna have to blow up this chapter to get different shards of it into to crystallize in different chapters, because it does bring this question up, and on top of that, there is a loaded, extraordinarily loaded discourse that plays on gender stereotypes and sexual stereotypes, where certain forms of discussion, like say seduction, right, figure into this this discourse on rebellion, right? That this so and so goes out and seduces these towns. Obviously it's not just romantic, but it is bringing that, it blurs the line between, say, the romantic and the ideological, I wonder to what extent sometimes is this like a part of an overdetermination that takes place, just where words might not be meaning a whole lot at this point in time, so let's see what sticks, or if this is a regular part of sort of a governing practice, right? To be able to sort of capture the figure rhetorically in order to then say put them up for.
Richard, could I suggest something? And that is, again, the context is completely different, but I think you might find it useful. And that is, it is Chris Hedges's American Fascist. Mm-hmm. And what he's talking about in that is he's talking about the emergence of of Christian nationalism in the United States. Mm-hmm. But what he really is interested in is a more intellectual project of understanding the usurpation of language, mm-hmm. and the resignification of language, and how that is grafted kind of seamlessly onto sort of known entities that are familiar to people who are not necessarily understanding the process that's taking place before their very eyes. Mm-hmm. And I think particularly his section on the resignification of language would be helpful. It's not hyper-theoretical, but it's definitely germane to what you're writing about.
Yeah, no, it's strange because I think, I've taught elements of this topic of spirituality in different writing classes, and noticing just how much that this whole sort of sort of semiotic, there's a semiotic aspect to these, yes. Right? And there's a really great book by Jonathan O'Donnell, I think his name is, called Passing Orders. And which is just fantastic, right? Because it does exactly this, and it's showing it within the context of Christian nationalism coming out of the war on terror. And you know, I keep wondering, like, why did I wind up picking political spirituality? Like, because before, like, to be honest with you, the way that it happened, and I don't know how, if you had this experience when you were writing your dissertation, is like, I had this broader idea, and I was like, wait a minute, I'm trying to do way too much. Then all of a sudden, I like just locked in on this one variable, on political spirituality. And it came out of it mostly just through my interactions with Paul Rabenau, who was sort of developing an anthropology that wherein political spirituality or spirituality was a part of that. And so, you know, and I just thought, this seems really interesting. Let's go, let me get into it. And, you know, the interesting thing about that project that Foucault takes up around, you know, going to Iran, right, and sometimes just botching it, right? What he was trying to do in that project was develop this sort of reportage of ideas. And I think this is where, you know, he for as admirable a task, right, he gets himself into a lot of trouble. Yet at the same time, that whole project comes out of those earlier lectures, because he was talking about the Taborites and the Catars and the different heretical movements right, in the months before, and how sort of spirituality figures as an act of escape or rebellion, you know, just in the months before he goes to Iran. So it's already in the back of his mind, and he's trying to think, like, what is this?
Well, you know, I was just thinking, as you were talking, even before you said that we're all, as we're producing our work, we're all swimming in the milieu in which we're living. And, you know, just as the liberal historians of the second half of the 19th century completely excised the Catholic Church from any agency at all in independence, that it's not just a non-actor, it's a hostile actor. You know, we're swimming in this particular milieu, and so it makes sense for us. I mean, I think about this a good bit. Do we endanger our topics by sort of historicizing them from our own historical vantage point, or do we enrich it, or both? But it, you know, it does. I was just at a conference a week or so ago where someone was talking about, you know, what we need to, and this is true, what we need to do is we need to read primary sources, understanding only what the writers wrote, how they understood it. And I thought, I don't agree with that. We should seek to understand that. And yet, you know, we understand about subjectivities and you know, hidden transcripts, and you know, we don't want to get lost in that particular set of high grass, but on the other hand, we can't lose sight of it either. I'm using terrible mixed metaphors today. And you know, the fact that, you know, Foucault is talking about the Iranian Revolution in 1979, 1980, doesn't force you to have to contextualize that term so fully that, I mean, I think you maybe could do better with that term than he did, actually, in what you're doing. Particularly given, I mean, I've had this come up in my classes over the years. Students will say, I don't understand what happens. You know, did people just give up Catholicism with independence? And of course, the answer is, of course not. And you can see all kinds of resistance and kickback and pushback. And so to sort of see it more fully, the way I really do like very much how you are using this. I think you just got so much more you could do.
Thank you.
Richard, it wasn't entirely, I mean, you use on purpose two different terms, political theology and political spirituality. And so political theology is the kinds of things that we know the best about this period, right? So you have Servando Teresa de Mier, that kind of completely, that's kind of these odds, twists to the reading of independence, and all sorts of things are happening there. And so St. Thomas appears, it happens to be Quetzalcoatl, and Our Lady of Guadalupe happens to be some kind of pre-indigenous or pre-colonial devotion, and so New Spain becomes Anahuac, etc., etc. And in these very political terms, theological political terms, the other guy is also Hidalgo that you described, that kind of like a priest himself, so too is Morelos, everybody else in this first rebellion of 1810. That are kind of mobilized, that are justifying the rebellion also in theological terms, as it were, particularly against France. No, it's not against Spain, it's against France. But in the process, it becomes a rebellion against Gachupines, mostly by Americanos that kind of are pissed off with the control they have over positions and money, and well, what they seem to be. Morelos seems to, Hidalgo seems to reject them the most is kind of the control they have over institutions, right? But then you bring up these other three things here, these three cases of naturaleza, of truth-telling, and subject formation that are more about emotions. I mean, it seems to me that you're trying to make a distinction between theology and ideas, and ideology and emotions, right? And lived experience in the rebellion that is political spirituality. And so there's that. But when reading the documents produced by Hidalgo, 4 documents that are produced in this period from September of 1810 to December of 1810. They are the least spiritual documents I read.
Exactly.
I am thrilled when I read Bolivar and his letter from Jamaica. That there's a lot of spirituality in that safeguard discourse. I mean, there's a lot of force, spiritual force, and that kind of that, it moves you. That goes beyond ideas. It really, at least to me, it speaks to me spiritually.
No, right.
Wow, I would have joined.
Right, it's a structure of affect.
Yes,
right?
exactly. But in the case of Morelos, in the case of Hidalgo, there's not. I mean, it's the least spiritual document I've ever read. The Manifiesto. It's a kind of a defense against the Inquisition. I'm not an atheist. I'm a cura. This is against we are Americanos and we are all equal and we're against the Spaniards. And that's it. So my question is, where is that affective dimension, this reconstruction affective dimension in the rebellion that is all over, right? As Eric Van Young has shown, I mean, one of the points of Eric Van Young's The Other Rebellion is that we should not be looking at the structures.
That's right.
Theological, philosophical, political structures, but structures of emotion. And
very unstable ones at that, right? Because one thing that he notices is that sometimes loyalties play cheap. The loyalty, people can switch loyalty. Desertion was a very big factor, right? That it wasn't as if the rhetorical appeals of the rebellion were in themselves sort of effectively totalizing. They went up against one another, right? The battles between, say, Morelos and Jose Maria Cos during that post-Hidalgo period, right? And then Rayon's also sort of ouster, and then all of a sudden him sort of becoming a kind of semi-reconstructed royalist, and I think this is sort of what makes it tricky, right? Because to kind of interpret the texts in a somewhat, how do you interpret the text in a way that does justice to to sort of the dynamics of their reception and the state in which the people receiving them is already unstable, because in Morelos you have something like Los Sentimientos de la Nación, which he helps open up the Congress of Chilpancingo, right? And it's these 23 theses that he believes, right, are these. This is the way. This is how a nation feels. Like, how is it? It could have been ideas de la nación, but why does he go to sentimientos? Right, the sentiments of the nation. Of course, because sentiment isn't just sort of feelings. But it's sensibility, right? It's this kind of. I don't even want to say like a Weltanschauung. No, it's not even that, right? But it's something more basic. It's like a kind of logic of sense of sorts, and how you can reproduce that into or produce that on a broader scale, to sort of speak of the kind of national character as this sort of compounded affect. But I think what Dr. McMahon was saying too about this question of how are they received, right? There's some really great work that was done a couple of decades ago by Francois Javier Guerra, right, where he was trying to develop these ideas of how civil society develops through the press in a way. And it's very kind of like he draws on Habermas a lot to develop this notion of the public, right? But at the same time, it feels very formalist, so it's hard to detect, right, those the productions of effects, right? And I kind of have to, sometimes I have to, unfortunately, like, I found myself wondering, it's like, oh man, am I kind of like, am I sort of inscribing this set of effects,
Yeah, no, I think that's why it'll be interesting to maybe trace out their expectations, right, for how this stuff spreads, but also to bring out like the possibility of how this is orally transmitted, or these ways that go beyond the kind of like print-based everything, revolutionary and modern, right? Like, no, of course you don't want to do that.
Right.
But yeah.
Well, and Jorge, you were mentioning something too about about Hidalgo's writings. Like, his writings are actually, they're pretty bland, right? But when you have when you put him next to Francisco Severo Maldonado, who is his sort of second in Guadalajara, and he's writing the newspapers where he does the political theory, right? El Despertador Americano comes out right alongside of it. And and I mentioned it, I think, I'm pretty sure I mentioned it in the chapter, right? That's where sort of the real, where the most impassioned discourse sort of takes flight and engages with these ideas, and I think it would be hard to sort of separate Hidalgo from Maldonado in that respect, at least in that moment in time, because they had, at the very least, they were co-conspirators, right? And just the language that we use, like conspiracy or in spirit, right? There's this notion of developing repetition, right? And circular repetition to produce a sort of sense, this sort of aleatory sense of who we are in our place in our time and which directions can we go in. I find that to be sort of where political spirituality seems to try and, like, I think it's a very blunt instrument, and at the same time, not a very surgical one, right? I don't think it's one where you can sort of, it's not like, I don't see it as having, at the time, right, as having that kind of like rationality that it can sort of perceive its effects like an algorithm does. So, it's kind of like pre-algorithmic, affect structurings.
So we have two questions from the online audience. I guess we can collect those two questions. I think Javier had his hand raised first, and then also Jenny Delgado. So we guess.
Okay, so thank you very much for the talk. I enjoyed really very much your reading. So I was thinking about the concept of nature that you are talking in one of the sections. Do you mean nature in the sense of the Enlightenment? I mean, theologians, until I have understand within the context of Reformation of Spain, in Bourbonic Spain, they were enlightened priests, right? And in that sense, I was thinking that in the sense of the reform in Spain, Hidalgo takes these ideas of the Enlightenment, of reform, and tries to say, okay, I will use this as a secular and use nature as a narrative based on the Enlightenment thinking of 18th century Spain, 18th century Iberia. This is my question. So thank you very much.
No, thank you, Javier. That's a really great question, because my tendency is to think that, you know, when he goes back to, when he sort of makes his appeal to Cicero, right? And Cicero is his go-to, is very much in Hidalgo's mind as he's developing his political ideas. I kind of think that what he's doing is trying to revive a more sort of, you know, a notion of a kind of natural law notion of nature, right? It might not be sort of the high Thomist natural law framework, but one that actually sort of becomes is a more kind of you know, political common sense pre-theoretical notion that then can be sort of laid out can get sort of spread out into what it is that I think what he's really trying to do is in a way try to restore the notion of nature from something that was perhaps perverted by, in his opinion, by the notion, the extractive notion of nature in the Bourbon reforms, or that the Bourbon reforms really tried to sort of intensify. Because he is a lot different from someone say like when you read Clavijero and Landívar, when they talk about nature. Clavijero is much more sort of clear about wanting to think about nature as a source of economic utility and profit, and there's a really short piece that he wrote about it. And Landívar sort of does kind of the opposite. He talks about the rusticatio mexicana, which he's actually just talking about Guatemala. When you read rusticatio and you've been to Guatemala, you're like, no, he's talking about Guatemala, not Mexico City. His idea of nature still includes that particular, potential, natural fruits for the development, economic development of the people, but also there's a romance to it too. There's a kind of nostalgia for the field, right? Por el campo. The subtitle of the Rusticatio Mexicana, right, is Por los Campos de México. So yeah, I think there is that kind of like almost this reintroduction of an older concept that they're remediating. Does that make sense?
Yes, some kind of. Because I was thinking about because well, you brought up Cicero, but I was thinking a little bit about the those who I don't remember very well, the French. Well, the French people that believe that more or less in the value of the land. I don't remember very well them. Yeah, but there was the case. One of the representatives of this school is François Quesnay. Yeah, I think it's I don't remember very well the name of this school, but they were talking about the value of the land and the value of working the land. So I was thinking really much about this relationship between the ideas of the Enlightenment developed in France and how they influenced, in this case, the Iberic world, because both were Bourbons, right? It's pretty much before the French Revolution. So I was thinking about very much about this correlation between the developments done in France and its influence in Spain during the Bourbon regime of Carlos III.
Yeah, no, and this for me is the period. The thing about the period, about this period that vexes me is sort of like, how does the political economy, how do notions of political economy sort of pop up in here, and in these discourses, and sometimes it doesn't feel like it very much, right? And Van Young kind of in The Other Rebellion really is, trying to sort out like how much of this is an agrarian revolution and how much of it wasn't, right? How much of this was, to what extent is independence, is the movement for independence kind of, political but without the economy explicitly per se, and at what points do they touch, and I think that this is sort of this is the tricky part. I'm still trying to wrestle with that.
But when you read Hidalgo's manifesto, whatever, one of the striking things about his political economy is that it's not physiocracy, it's not capitalism, it's not liberalism. It's the most naive, strange argument about things are going to be wonderful once we get rid of the Galgachipinas. That's it.
Yeah.
And so wealth is going to come back because they are kind of course taking all the wealth away with them, because they are monopolizing all the positions and monopolizing all the power, and so eventually this will become a utopia. He actually uses that word, I think. We'll be rich and we'll be prosperous, etc., magically by getting rid of all Gachupinis. So that is the naturaleza is kind of this very Habsburg traditional understanding of naturaleza, in which the kingdom belongs to the naturales, right? Now, it doesn't belong to those who are not naturales. In this case, the trees are not naturales, and they are unnatural in that they are moving through the ocean and leaving behind their families to be away from their families unnaturally.
It's a very passive notion of nature in a lot of ways, that it's something that's passively received and impressed upon the self, which is very different from, and perhaps this is sort of where Hidalgo ends and then say Mier begins, where he's actually saying, no, there's actually a project of developing the self as Mexicano. This is what it means to be Mexicano. You engage your history, and this is the history of the Alshan. Yeah, because I think I keep wondering as I was reading, where are the economic arguments? And in a way, you almost couldn't. I was like, what accounts for that massive silence? Is it something that? Is it because priests weren't? Was it bad form for priests to do that? I don't know. Because priests had their own haciendas too, right? They had their own economic concerns going on in their jurisdiction.
But there's also the manifesto. The manifesto, he makes a distinction between Gachupinis who belong to the church, who should be left alone. Everybody's fine. If you're a bishop, if you're a priest, and you have to be Spanish, you should be left alone. Nothing happens to you. But if you are a Gachupin who is outside the church, you have to behave. You have to kind of abide by the rules, and if you abide by the rules, nothing will happen to you. But if you don't abide by the rules, you'll be either killed or your property will be you'll
be expropriated.
Expropriated, essentially, yeah.
Or your legs will be slit. Or
you'll be killed. Yes, if you happen to be more aggressive in your reaction against rules. But what I'm trying to say is the notion of naturaleza is very. It's a naturaleza. It's a notion of citizenship. Who is a natural? It's not really naturaleza in terms of nature and the rules of nature.
No, exactly.
And the rules of wealth, and where's wealth coming from, whether from the land or from commerce or whatever. And in that sense, it reads very it's everything but effective. It's very I wasn't moved. It's not Cicero who's writing. It's,
No.
yeah, so there is a little power of rhetoric. Yeah, and it seems like the mechanisms are more on the mechanics of how the information, how the armies are moving. You go town to town, in every town you do this, and you read this document, and people gather, and so there's a repetition, and it's in the process and pageantry and mechanism of gathering the armies that where the effect happens. Not so much in the words.
Right.
It's not so much in the logic and philosophy. And that is why I thought it made sense for you to make a separation between political theology. There's very little of it.
Yeah, no, exactly.
And political effect, political.
And there's just enough theology in certain places, right, that it's passable, right? The appeal to Guadalupe is so. Why is it so effective, right? There is sort of a theological significance to her that is, of course, there are all these theological significances, but they're also popular, devotional aspects to it that make her more of a protector than sort of an abstract Christ does, because if these ministers are out there, administering the sacrament, right, and that sacrament is Jesus, right, that seems still very far away. Then it is this mother figure who is sort of a lot like. By all accounts, it's pretty human.
Yeah. But it's also the definition. It's again. I mean, I'm reading here the only reference he has to the reino que patrocina su Santísima Madre y su Milagrosa Imagen de Guadalupe. It's just one sentence in a 5-page document. But what is striking about the document and his appeal to the population, and how the divisions are created and how the armies are grown, is the fact that it's an appeal to. We are a community, we are not Gachupines, we are all equal. There are slaves, there are no slaves, Indians, there are no Indians. We are all Americanos, period. And what makes us Americanos is that we have this common devotion.
Right, it's on the blessing, right? It's the standard holds, bears the image, right, of one, right? So much so that it applies in different aspects. This appeal to Guadalupe appears in his blessing very differently from, say, someone like Hidalgo, but then again, the church authorities try and sort of wrest back Mary. She's very much a figure of, under contestation, but I think you're right in the sense that this sort of performative aspect, right, of the gathering and the kind of spreading the news, so to speak, it is where the affective aspect takes place. And then what these discourses do is leave us traces of that we almost have to kind of imagine a bit, that those kinds of social practices that allow the accumulation of power through collaboration to take place in a way, and its mobilization. I noticed.
We had another question from Jenny, who had her hand raised. I don't know if she still wants to make their question, or maybe I don't know. She had her hand raised for a long time, but I don't know.
You mean me?
No, we have another online audience guest, Jenny Delgado, but I don't think she.
Okay. Oh, Jenny. Okay. There we go.
Thank you. I'm Jenny Delgado. I'm a theologian. I was very interested when I read the title of this presentation, because as a theologian, I was like, what interesting to hear about this or your work. About what happened between a colony to the republic. I'm Peruvian, coming from a different region, who also was colonized in the south from what we call the Peru. But my interesting is my question coming from the work that I doing of the Ayala theology, who is prophetic, also renew the way that we see Christianity for native people and their descendants like me in this new generation of the post-colonial, of the colonial time. We know that Christianity arrived in our land 5 centuries ago. We know it coming with Christian missionaries and with soldados and soldiers, and with one hand we have the Bible, the faith, and the other we have the swords and the guns who kill native people, and was this oppression between the colonizers, the Spanish in our case, or the Portuguese in the case of the people in Brazil, or the English for the North. But now we see like this political idea of, oh, all faith are giving freedom to the people. And just the professor mentioned, is like the Indians are equals. I don't know where this coming from, because even 500 centuries later, 500 years later, now we see that we still have Indians, when we know India is a different subcontinent in Asia. Here is native people or regional peoples who struggle to assimilate to these European Christianity ideas of practices. My question's coming like, I don't know if you focus your idea of political theology and about how this theology was imposed for native population. Because when I hear in the last hour, I see like everyone is equal, or native people acting as a Spanish or have power. Until today, we see it's not true, because we see a lot of people get oppressed and have difficulties to even relationship with their own governments. Mexico is one. Peru right now is crazy in all these political relationship with native people or indigenous people with the government, and Bolivia, and we have so many examples of resistance of native people against the government, the political situation. How religions coming out. We know the Catholic Church is married with the political situation. This is how we have so many, after the Republic, we have so many Spanish in power, because was the Spanish descendants who was in power of the new republics, never the native people, right? If we know that for fact, all what we are reading and saying is talking about the Spanish people who all have the power. This is how now, even they say that people in the United States are Hispanic because it's descendant of the Spanish people, and never mention that native people who have native descendants too, but we try to white out, blanquear, right? We can make it white history, everyone can believe it. As it's easy, because it's how we learn how to read history that in the last centuries. But when we say it's a political theology process, can be interesting to hear more about this theology coming from and what theology is for you, because I hear more religious aspect of the institution that the theology is behind that. Like, where is the idea like theology? Like, where is the theology to use from this new Spain to Mexico process? That can be interesting to hear. Thank you.
Thank you. No, that's a great question. There's been a rash of really great work on on the role of this, or the church post-independence, right? People like Brian Connaughton, of course, but others are thinking about sort of how does the church reckon with this, because it wasn't so much at least in the case of New Spain, right? It didn't seem like the the fight was against the church per se, right? The church kind of was, was very, you would have some insurgent priests, some royalist priests, and some priests moving in between. And so, the question of, I think, developing, where the theology sort of gets developed from is important. And at the same time, the political aspect of, or the political space within which several indigenous peoples were operating in, right? Where there were still, you would have royalist indigenous people, right? And likewise, but so, and I think Van Young discusses this with an immense amount of nuance. And it's just such a doorstop of a book that it's kind of hard to find like what is the specific art. I get his overall argument, but it's sometimes just hard to, when he gets so in the weeds, to say, the question of the indigenous, despite this, sort of, leveling on the part of the insurgency and and independence movements, it doesn't go away, right? It's despite that sort of proposed change in civil status, the social questions still remain. And Van Young was kind of saying, well, sometimes yes and sometimes no. They kind of engaged in the ways that they wanted to, and the ways they saw fit for their communities, right? Is a rather pragmatic calculation, rather than a kind of rather than a kind of ideological calculation, so to speak. So, but yeah. But so what I guess what I was trying to do with this essay was try to make it less about religion, and to think about the practical functions of religion and religious discourse, and the ways in which it can be sort of used. And sometimes that the discourse, insofar as it touches on spirituality, might be informed by theological points, sure, but it's not necessarily wedded to that. That it has there's a different project going on that it will use. It will use what it needs to articulate its political aims, and to sort of articulate its, not simply its interests, but the kind of futures it might be anticipating, whether consciously or not, utopia or not.
So in the book, how do you get from Americanos? Because in Hidalgo, that is clearly the category that is used of citizenship. Whoever was born here is a citizen, either or not born, because he's clear with the slaves as well. The slaves are free and they are Americanos. Indians should not pay tribute and they are Americanos. We are Americanos. We are all Americanos except those who are from Spain, and they do not belong. And that is the definition of citizenship. It's very primitive. In terms of theology and in terms of political liberalism. But how do you get from that definition of citizenship and naturaleza to Mexico? So
there's one. When I was looking at the Apansingan and Chilpancingo period, in 1814, 1815, all of a sudden, the Constitution, the proposed Constitution, is the Constitution of La América Mexicana, and there's a portion in this discussion leading up to it where it's still America, and all of a sudden there's this change. And I'm still trying to figure out, like, where can I look to find, where is this change in nomenclature coming from? right? And why? Servando has his ideas later on, right? And he's kind of he's depending on this change already, in saying that somos mexicanos, and you write with Mexico with an X and not with a J, and this is why. Here's my political theological myth. But there's this movement between like early 1814, late 1815, where something's happening. I'm still trying to point my finger on it. One of the first mentions of addressing sort of the Congress that I've seen comes from Texas, where it calls La Nación Mexicana. And I'm like, okay, this is curious. So I'm still trying. I see this whole. I'm kind of like, where do I go? Where am I supposed to be looking for this? I'm still kind of, todavía estoy en busca. But I'm glad you bring up that question, because it's vexing for me, because like there's no sort of formal structure of nomenclature or standardizing the nomenclature, right? Although there kind of is, but in a very retroactive fashion. There are theories as to how nomenclature functions that isn't necessarily like based on any linguistic theory or sociolinguistic theory, right? But there's a politics of language and a language of politics, right? Where Mexico means something, and America does, but not quite what Mexico means later on. Why? I'm still, this will always, I think, this will always bother me, I think. It's been bothering me for.
Well, Mexico's been there all the time. I mean, you have a discourse. I mean, if you go to political theology and political philosophy, Mexico's been there for generations.
Yeah.
It's when you don't have that political philosophy or that political theology, in case of Morelos, Hidalgo, when you all you have is affect, no theology, no structural ideas, no political economy, no political philosophy, nothing, no categories of citizenship that are kind of leading to some notion of kingdomness or nation. It is when the Americano fills in.
It's almost like a placeholder.
Yeah, so there's no problem for anyone to define Mexico prior to
it was Patria Chica, it was Mexico City, basically.
Yeah, I don't know, it's the notion of the kingdom of Mexico. There's a kingdom.
The Kingdom of New Spain.
Well, but it's replaced for, I mean, already in what is the name of the guy, the Jesuit Clavijero, it's transforming to Mexico.
Yeah.
So by 1780, it's already Mexico. So Mexico, it's a category, political category that is already available to anyone except to Hidalgo.
Which is strange. Maybe, I don't know, perhaps it might be a regional thing too, right? That it, I'm thinking here about like John Tutino, like the ways in which he talks about the Bajío as having a certain, as having, he situates, right, the movement for independence as happening from within the peripheries of Mexico City and in this sort of immensely rich region. But as to how those, tacit, then tacit political economic factors to figure into nomenclature, I think it might have more to do with just kind of the situatedness of the actors, right? What is Hidalgo's formation like? Is he, he might be brilliant, right? But he might not have had sort of the kinds of contacts that, say, the Jesuits did in being able, even the displaced Jesuits or even Dominicans or Augustinians, to be able to have that interchange of, intellectual interchange, right? To think about these ideas on the grander scale. It seems that this was a very sort of, this first revolt is a very kind of localized, for the most part, localized if not regionalized thing, right? Because of course he's accused in the conspiracy of Querétaro, right? That sort of thwarts the independence movement and delays it by about a year or so. But it seems that there's a regional aspect to it that sort of accounts for this kind of friction between what is it for one set of people and what might be for another set of people, but actually kind of isn't, because you're right. Then there is a kind of like almost I don't know, it's primitive, naive, I don't know, but just kind of like it's almost as if like he's restarting from almost nothing and trying to build the plane while he's flying it, to make a mixed metaphor, right? It's very improvisational, and he doesn't last that long, and where does he wind up getting caught? He's on his way to Coahuila. I mean, why are they going up north? I still have to understand that too. It's like because he passed up going to Mexico City.
Oh, I have a question.
And
From...
was
Yes.
Hi, yeah, thank you, Richard, for your paper, and this conversation is fascinating, and I think that there are some things that are going to be very difficult to untangle, and so what I noticed about your paper too, so I also kind of had a similar question about when are we going to get to Mexico in here, and it seems like from what you're suggesting and kind of this idea of La América Mexicana, it's just after the period that you're really focusing on in terms of the pamphlets and the broadsides and the correspondence that is being circulated. It's like, it's this period of when there is so much uncertainty and so much uncertainty, not only in terms of the insurgents, but also in terms of what's going on in Spain and the Regency Council, right? And so there's a lot of improvisation on both sides. And it also makes me wonder to what extent then it's insurgents versus royalists, because it sounds also just from like one of the letters that talks about the Virgen Guadalupe, she's a queen. So there's still kind of this idea of something about monarchy that still holds a measure of legitimacy and sovereignty that they're still experimenting with. And so I'm just wondering kind of if it might be helpful to think, and that's also somewhat kind of pointing to one of the comments Jenny made and also made before about kind of like how many different players were involved and kind of the complexity of all these issues at this moment. So it seems like that dichotomy between Americans and Europeans is definitely the terms that Hidalgo is using and those guys are using. But I'm not so sure that they would see the Europeans just as royalists, because in some ways they also were kind of thinking through, well, liberalism as a possibility, but I don't know if they're yet Republicans uniformly. I mean, and you were mentioning kind of 1831 is where there's this catechism of republicanism, but that's a very different context from like this period of uncertainty. So I was just wondering if that could be something that could be helpful to think with, kind of that dichotomy might be getting in the way of your being able to communicate how complex and how much improvisation is going on in this time.
Yeah, I think that's my first instinct was, yeah, you're right. At the same time, I kind of want to think like, okay, how do I use that as that sort of dialectic as a framing device? Because of course that's sort of the kind of insurgent royalist kind of doesn't necessarily, I don't know, like it feels to me that's a more political position than say the ethnic division, right, between Gachupines and Americanos, right? That it might account for a bit longer sort of time span beyond the Hidalgo moment. and thinking alongside this other, the pre-1814 suppressions, and that sort of, that Morelos part, and then there's this sort of underground insurgency, so to speak, that gets sort of, that's sporadic, and then all of a sudden kind of.
But I think leading on to something that in that you have in the same way that you have a gap between Hidalgo and Morelos, in which Hidalgo, it's all Americanos, and all of a sudden Morelos begins to be Mexicano. You also have a gap between an Hidalgo that is all monarchy, all monarchy, and a Morelos that all of a sudden is all republic. So how do you account for that?
Well, I mean, there were writings from Hidalgo where he was thinking, like, developing, that there has to be a kind of Congress.
Yeah, but it's the Cortes. It's a monarchy, and they are just waiting for Ferdinand to be released. I mean,
Right.
This is actually an anti-Republican anti-French Republican movement. It's against the French and against Napoleon and against the French Republic. It's not.
Right.
It's for the monarchy.
Right.
Yeah.
Ostensibly, right.
Yeah, and all of a sudden, by the same curas, by 1812, they become. I mean, you reach Tupancingo and his republic.
Yeah.
It's no, and he's Mexico. And it's no longer a monarchy, and it's no longer Americanos.
I wonder.
So that sudden shift from one discourse to another.
I wonder if
it's not entirely clear how it's happening and why so quickly.
I wonder the extent to which sort of the capture and execution of that first wave of leadership may have disabused, people like Morelos and others of the likelihood that making good with making peace with an absent monarchy, right? And then when Ferdinand VII, when he comes back, right, in 1814, he doesn't necessarily deliver on their hopes anyways.
But Chilpancingo it's before 1814, and it's already very anti-monarchy, very Republican, and very Mexicano. It's no longer Americano, monarchical.
When also there's in Guerrero, right, or what becomes Guerrero, there's already a lot of rebellious activity, very anti-monarchical activity, that is still to this day is still sort of pockets of rebellion, right? But I think part of it might just be that there's an awareness in some quarters that there's no way out of this by monarchical means, right? That if this is what they're going to do to our leadership, even the leadership that wants a monarchy, might as well just not want the monarchy, might as well just dispense with that illusion altogether.
Well, it might well be in what you're exploring, the dimension of spiritual politics, the dimension of affect that is leading to this transformation. Not so much a dimension of philosophy and theology, but the dimension of affect that is creating the transformation. I mean, it's just a suggestion we're into exploring, because that is what the essay is about, right?
Well, and what's interesting too is that, I mean, some of the parts that I excised from this, it was a long chapter. There was this letter from her lessons, Larondo, I think her name is, but she writes a letter to Hidalgo saying, me and some comrades of ours captured this colonel of a Spanish dragoon, and we did this. And she writes this as a demonstration of her affection for him and her friendship with him. But that's part of the discourse, right? It wasn't just, hey, I did this because this is, practically, we're in line practically. No, it's a much more, it's those bonds of friendship. I just feel that, at least for the sake of managing, to keep it manageable and short, somewhat within like 12,000 words, I needed to figure out what to keep, right? But I think, yes, the affective component is powerful. That first wave holds a charisma that somehow gets, that even 100 years after, right, gets re-celebrated and commemorated, right? In a way that someone like Iturbide's consummation of independence doesn't. Even though, yes, mentioned, but not to the, Iturbide is not this legendary figure in the way that, Hidalgo, for all his, for all the faults, it doesn't have. This is, it's strange how we make our heroes.
And what people choose to remember.
Yeah.
Memorialize. You memorialize the grito. You don't memorialize
Right.
whatever Iturbide did.
Right. Pan de iguala, you ring the bell.
Well, thank you very much. I think we have reached our time, and appreciate it, Richard, and everybody. And
Thank you very much.
Amy,
It's been a wonderful session. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
thanks. All right.
Bye-bye, everybody.